Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The fragile frequency. How a teletype pulse and the shadow war of signals nearly destroyed Operation Overlord. The history of the Second World War is often painted in broad strokes of steel and fire, defined by the industrial might of nations and the strategic movements of millions of men. Yet, beneath the visible surface of artillery barrages and tank divisions lay a subterranean world of silence, encryption, and deception. This was the War of the Ether, the electromagnetic battlefield where the weapon of choice was not a high-explosive shell, but a radio wave, a teletype pulse, or a cipher key. In the spring of 1944, as the Allied forces coiled like a massive spring along the southern coast of England, preparing to unleash Operation Overlord, the greatest amphibious invasion in human history, the margin between victory and total catastrophe did not rest solely on the courage of the infantrymen. It rested on a terrifyingly fragile architecture of secrecy. The entire outcome of the war in Europe hinged on the ability of the Allies to hide an army of 2 million men while they were shouting on the radio. And in the agonizing days leading up to June 6, 1944, that silence was nearly shattered not by a German spy or a battlefield defeat, but by a series of electronic anomalies, human errors, and a single, phantom teletype signal that threatened to broadcast the invasion to the world before the first boot hit the sand. To understand the gravity of the single signal that almost exposed D-Day, one must first descend into the paranoid, high-stakes atmosphere of 1944, where a single loose sentence or a burst of static could alter the fate of civilization. The geopolitical and military context of early 1944 was one of suffocating tension. The Third Reich, though reeling from defeats in the East against the Soviet Union and the loss of North Africa and Sicily, remained a lethal adversary. The Atlantic Wall, a chain of fortifications stretching from the borders of Spain to the Arctic Circle in Norway, was being hardened under the supervision of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Rommel knew that the Allies had to invade. He knew they had to strike in northern France. The only variable missing from his equation was the where and the when. If the Germans could pinpoint the landing site and the time of the assault, they could concentrate their panzer divisions, the elite armored reserves, and crush the invasion force on the beaches. If the Allies were thrown back into the sea, it would take years to mount another invasion. The war could drag on indefinitely, perhaps allowing Germany to develop its wonder weapons, the V-2 rockets and jet fighters, or negotiate a separate peace. Thus, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was not merely managing a military operation. He was the custodian of the single most valuable secret in modern history. The codename for the invasion itself was Overlord, but the naval phase was Neptune, and the specific details of the landings were locked behind a security classification higher than top secret, known as bigot. To be bigoted meant you held the keys to the kingdom. You knew the dates, the tides, and the locations: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The security protocols surrounding bigot were draconian. Documents were double-bagged in canvas and weighted with lead so they could be thrown overboard if a ship was captured. Officers privy to the plans were forbidden from flying over enemy territory to prevent capture and interrogation. The fear of a leak was so pervasive that it bordered on institutional neurosis. This fear was justified. The Allies were maintaining a radio silence of epic proportions while simultaneously conducting the loudest deception campaign in history, Operation Fortitude. Fortitude was the art of the fake signal. Through the use of double agents, inflatable tanks, and dummy landing craft, the Allies created a phantom army, the 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, commanded by the flamboyant General George S. Patton. FUSAG was stationed in Kent, directly across from the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. The goal was to convince the German High Command that the attack would come there, not Normandy. This deception relied almost entirely on radio traffic. Allied radio operators spent months transmitting fake orders, mimicking the routine of a massive army that didn't exist. They created a pattern of life in the ether, mess hall schedules, fuel requisitions, training exercises, all designed to be intercepted by German listening stations. It was a masterpiece of fiction writing, done with Morse code and encryption machines. However, for the deception to work, the real radio traffic had to be flawless. And it was here, in the friction between the fake signals and the real ones, that the invasion faced its greatest perils. The first crack in the armor of secrecy occurred in late April 1944, during Exercise Tiger. This was a full-scale rehearsal for the landing on Utah Beach, conducted at Slapton Sands in Devon, a beach chosen for its topographical similarity to Normandy. The exercise was a disaster of coordination and communication. Due to a typographical error in the orders, the American LSTs, landing ship, tank, were on a different radio frequency than the British escort corvettes supposed to protect them. This signal gap meant that when the British spotted a flotilla of German E-boats, fast, torpedo-armed attack craft, slipping into the bay, they could not warn the Americans. The E-boats tore into the convoy like wolves into a flock of sheep. Torpedoes slammed into the unarmored hulls of the LSTs. LST 507 and LST 531 were sunk. LST 289 was damaged. In the freezing waters and the burning oil, 749 American servicemen died, more than would die during the actual invasion of Utah Beach. But the immediate panic at SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, was not just for the loss of life. It was for the bigots. 10 officers with bigot-level clearance were missing in the carnage. If the Germans captured even one of them alive and used truth serum or torture, the secret of Normandy would be blown. The invasion would be cancelled. A frantic recovery operation was launched, not to save lives, but to find the bodies of those 10 men. The invasion remained in a state of suspended animation until the last body was identified, ensuring the secret had died with them. This tragedy highlighted the lethal consequence of a radio frequency error, a single wrong number on a dial leading to a massacre and a strategic crisis. As the calendar turned to May and then June, the atmosphere in England became electric. The entire southern portion of the country was essentially a sealed military camp. Civilians were restricted from travel. Mail was censored with extreme prejudice. Diplomatic pouches were grounded. The pressure on the thousands of clerks, teletype operators, and radio signalmen was immense. These were often young men and women, working 12 to 16-hour shifts, processing the logistical nightmare of moving an army. It was in this environment of exhaustion and high anxiety that the Daily Telegraph crossword puzzle incident occurred. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, the puzzle, compiled by a schoolteacher named Leonard Daw, began to feature words that were codenames for the invasion: Utah, Omaha, Overlord, Mulberry, and Neptune. MI5 agents descended on the schoolteacher, convinced he was a German spy passing signals through the newspaper. It turned out to be a staggering coincidence. Daw had let his students fill in the puzzle grids, and the boys had picked up the words from overheard conversations among the soldiers billeted nearby. It was a benign signal leak, but it frayed the nerves of the intelligence community to the breaking point. They were seeing shadows everywhere. Then came the incident that nearly stopped the heart of the Allied command. It was June 3, 1944. The invasion force was loaded onto ships. The soldiers were sealed in their marshalling areas. The machine was in motion. In London, the headquarters of the Associated Press, AP, was buzzing. The press, too, had been preparing for the invasion. They had pre-written flashes, brief, urgent news bulletins, that would be released the moment the official communiqué was issued by Eisenhower's headquarters. These pre-written flashes were standard practice to ensure speed, but they were dangerous. At the AP bureau, a young teletype operator named Joan Ellis was working the machines. The teletype was the internet of its day, a mechanical typewriter connected by telegraph lines that could instantaneously print messages in newsrooms across the Atlantic. Ellis was practicing. She was bored, or perhaps just trying to ensure the tape was punched correctly for the big moment. She sat at the machine, feeding in a practice strip of perforated tape. The tape contained the pre-written flash announcing the invasion. In a moment of catastrophic error, the machine was not set to local or test mode. It was live. At 4:39 p.m. on June 3, teletype machines in newsrooms across the United States, in Havana, in Buenos Aires, and crucially, in Moscow, suddenly clattered to life. The bells on the machines rang, signaling a high-priority message. The text that printed out was short, capitalized, and earth-shattering: Flash. Associated Press. New York. Flash. Eisenhower's headquarters announces Allied landings in France. For a terrifying span of seconds, the secret was out. The message had been transmitted globally. The Associated Press in New York immediately moved to put the bulletin on the wires to radio stations and newspapers. In Moscow, the Soviet operators handed the message to their superiors. The Russians were allies, but their communications channels were notoriously leaky and monitored by German intelligence. The signal was traveling at the speed of light, bouncing off the ionosphere, racing through copper cables. If a German monitoring station in Lisbon, Stockholm, or Berlin picked up the AP transmission, or if a radio station in America broadcast it before it could be killed, the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht would be alerted. Rommel would know the game was afoot. He would know that the invasion was launching now. The horror at the AP London bureau was instantaneous. They realized the mistake within roughly 30 seconds. A kill order was frantically typed out. Bust that flash. Bust that flash. Transmitted in error. The kill message chased the flash message across the cables. In New York, editors screamed at operators to stop the presses. Radio announcers who were about to interrupt regular programming were waved down. The global machinery of news ground to a halt. But the signal had been airborne. It had existed. The question that haunted the Allied intelligence officers at SHAEF was, did the Germans hear it? German intelligence, the Abwehr and the SD, Sicherheitsdienst, monitored Allied press frequencies religiously. They knew that in a democracy, the press often knew things before the generals did. A flash from the AP was exactly the kind of open-source intelligence, OSINT, they were hunting for. If the Germans had intercepted that specific burst of teletype data, they would have seen it as the Go code. They would have looked at the weather, which was terrible on June 3rd, and perhaps hesitated, but they would have alerted the coastal defenses. The 15th Army, held in reserve at Pas-de-Calais, might have been ordered to readiness. The panzer divisions near Paris might have spun their flywheels. Miraculously, the Germans missed it. Or, more accurately, the German intelligence apparatus was so overwhelmed by the noise created by Allied deception that they couldn't distinguish the signal from the static. Operation Fortitude had created such a volume of fake radio traffic, fake reports, and fake threats that the Germans were suffering from analysis paralysis. They were looking for a complex military signal, a change in the Enigma encryption patterns, or a message from their controlled spies in England. They were not expecting the invasion to be announced by a clumsy teletype operator in London. Furthermore, the weather played a crucial role. The storms battering the English Channel were so severe that the Germans had relaxed their alert status. Rommel himself had left the front to go to Germany for his wife's birthday, confident that no invasion could happen in such gale force winds. The idea that the Allies would launch in a storm seemed militarily insane. So, when the AP flash flickered through the ether, it likely appeared as just another piece of confusion in a chaotic world. But the single signal threat didn't end with the AP mistake. The radio spectrum was the nervous system of the invasion, and it was incredibly vulnerable. On the night of the actual invasion, June 5th leading into June 6th, the Allies enforced a strict wireless silence for the invasion fleet. Thousands of ships were moving in the dark, without radar, to avoid detection, and without radio communication. Visual signals and strict timetables were the only way to coordinate. However, the deception war, the bodyguard of lies, was reaching its crescendo. While the real fleet was silent, the RAF and the Royal Navy were executing Operation Taxable and Operation Glimmer. These were electronic warfare operations designed to create the ghost of an invasion fleet on German radar screens near the Pas-de-Calais and Cap d'Antifer. Bombers flew precise, rectangular orbits, dropping window strips of aluminum foil, chaff, at carefully calculated intervals. The falling foil reflected German radar waves, creating a blob on the screens that moved at the speed of a slow naval convoy. Simultaneously, small launches towed balloons with radar reflectors and played recordings of anchor chains and shouting men over massive speakers. They generated radio traffic simulating a large fleet. This was the signal, weaponized. The Germans at the radar stations saw a massive armada approaching the Pas-de-Calais. They sounded the alarm. They sent their reserves to the wrong place. They believed the electronic ghost was the real invasion, while the real invasion, hidden under the cloak of radio silence and the noise of the storm, approached Normandy undetected. The irony of the single radio signal narrative is that the invasion was saved not just by the signals that were kept secret, like the bigot plans, but by the signals that were deliberately sent to confuse. The AP flash was an accidental truth that could have ruined everything. Operation Glimmer was a deliberate lie that saved everything. There is another layer to the single signal story, one involving the French resistance. The BBC broadcast personal messages personnels, nightly, strange, nonsensical phrases like, "The dice are on the table," or, "It is hot in Suez." These were codes for specific resistance cells to sabotage rail lines or cut telephone wires. The most famous of these was the stanza from Paul Verlaine's poem, Chanson d'automne. The first part, Les sanglots longs des violons de l'automne, the long sobs of the violins of autumn, was broadcast on June 1 to alert the resistance that the invasion was imminent. The German intelligence service, the SD, actually knew this code. They had intercepted it. When the BBC broadcast the second half of the stanza, "Bercent mon cœur d'une langueur monotone," soothe my heart with a monotonous languor, on the night of June 5, the German listening station at the Hotel Cecil in Paris intercepted it. They knew it meant the invasion would start within 48 hours. The German intelligence officer who heard it ran to his superiors. He told the chief of staff of the Obe West. And here, the friction of war intervened again. The German high command was so cynical, so tired of false alarms, and so convinced by the fortitude deception that the invasion would come later and at Calais, that they ignored the signal. They didn't wake Rommel. They didn't alert the 7th Army in Normandy. The signal was received, decoded, and understood, yet it was psychologically rejected. The near exposure of D-Day via the AP flash or the Exercise Tiger radio mix-up serves as a chilling reminder of the contingency of history. We look back on Overlord as an inevitable triumph of industrial power, but at the time, it was a gamble of staggering proportions. The difference between success and failure was measured in the discipline of a terrified 19-year-old radio operator, the intuition of a German radar technician, and the reliability of a teletype machine. If Joan Ellis's flash had been taken seriously by a German monitor, the paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne dropping into the Cotentin Peninsula that night would have descended into a waiting inferno. The landing craft at Omaha Beach, already destined for a bloodbath, would have faced fully alerted panzer divisions. The beachhead might have collapsed. In the end, the secret held. It held because of the wall of silence constructed by MI5 and the FBI. It held because the Germans had been blinded by their own arrogance and the brilliance of Allied deception. But it also held due to sheer, blind luck. The teletype signal that screamed, "Invasion," to the world was dismissed as a glitch, a phantom echo in the machine. The radio waves that carried the truth were lost in the static of the storm. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the Germans looked out from their bunkers and saw not a radio signal, but the horizon filled with ships. By then, it was too late for signals. The time for steel had arrived. The analysis of this event from a historical perspective requires us to look at the signal intelligence, SIGINT, war not just as a technical contest, but as a psychological one. The Allies understood that they could not hide the existence of the invasion force. The ships were there, the soldiers were there. What they could hide was the intent. They manipulated the signal-to-noise ratio. They flooded the German decision-making loop with so much conflicting data, fake armies, fake radio traffic, fake crossword clues, that when a real piece of dangerous data appeared, like the AP flash or the Verlaine poem, the Germans could not distinguish it from the background noise. This is the concept of cognitive electronic warfare. The AP flash incident is a perfect example of a black swan event, an unpredictable, rare, and catastrophic failure of protocol that no amount of planning could prevent. It highlights the vulnerability of centralized command and control systems. A single operator, bored and practicing on a live machine, bypassed the entire security apparatus of the Allied Expeditionary Force. Furthermore, the Exercise Tiger tragedy underscores the lethality of comms discipline. The frequency error wasn't just a technical glitch, it was an administrative failure that cost 749 lives. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, a typo is as deadly as a mine. The fact that the Germans intercepted the radio traffic from the sinking LSTs but failed to deduce the location of the invasion from it suggests that the Germans were compartmentalized to a fault. They saw a local victory, sinking convoys, but failed to stitch it into the larger strategic picture. Why are so many tank landing ships practicing here? The legacy of these near misses is woven into the doctrine of modern military operations. Today, Operations Security, OPSEC, and E-Mission Control, MCON, are religious tenets of naval and military planning. The fear of the accidental signal, now more likely to be a smartphone selfie or a fitness tracker app data leak than a teletype flash, remains the obsession of commanders. The night of June 3, 1944, remains the ultimate case study in the fragility of secrecy. It was the night the world almost knew, and the night the enemy, deafened by their own expectations, failed to hear the warning bell that rang right in their ears. To deeply appreciate the mechanics of this history, one must also look at the infrastructure of the news media in 1944. The Associated Press was a behemoth. Its leased wires crisscrossed the Atlantic. The relationship between the press and the military was symbiotic but tense. Correspondents were accredited and treated like officers, often privy to secrets, but subject to censorship. The Joan Ellis incident terrified the military because it exposed that the press was a conduit that could not be fully controlled. The censorship office, SHAEF censorship, was supposed to review every word. But a teletype operator hitting send bypasses the censor physically. It was a direct line. This technological bypass is a precursor to the modern dilemma of WikiLeaks or social media, where information escapes control instantly. Eisenhower was reportedly furious. The investigation was swift. Ellis was devastated. She hadn't intended treason, merely efficiency. But in the binary world of war, intent matters less than outcome. The outcome was a global broadcast of the most sensitive fact on Earth. Why did the Soviets not leak it? Moscow received the flash. Stalin was demanding a second front for years. He was desperate for the invasion. It is probable that the Soviets assumed it was true, or perhaps they were confused by the immediate kill order. But the Soviets also had spies in Germany, the Red Orchestra. If they had carelessly congratulated the Allies over an unsecured diplomatic channel, the Germans would have picked that up. The silence of the Soviet apparatus in those critical minutes is another overlooked factor in the preservation of the secret. As the sun set on June 5, the invasion fleet moved out. The weather had cleared just enough, a weather window, identified by the dour Scotsman, Group Captain James Stagg, the chief meteorologist. This, too, was a signal, a meteorological one. The Germans, lacking weather ships in the Atlantic, the Allies had sunk them, did not see the break in the weather coming. They only saw the storm. Stagg saw the lull. Eisenhower made the decision based on that subtle data point. Okay, let's go. The radio silence was absolute. Ships communicated with blinker lights. As they approached the French coast, the radar jamming aircraft were doing their work up north. The paratroopers were checking their gear. And in the AP office in London, and the intelligence bunkers of SHAEF, the men who knew about the teletype error held their breath, waiting for the German guns to open up, praying that the slip of a finger 3 days prior hadn't doomed them all. The guns did open up, but not until the landing craft dropped their ramps. The surprise was complete. The single signal had faded into the background radiation of history, a ghost story of the war, overshadowed by the visceral reality of Omaha Beach. But for the historians of information warfare, that pulse of electricity on June 3 remains a defining moment, a testament to how the fate of empires can hang on a copper wire and a moment of human carelessness. The invasion succeeded not because it was perfect, but because its secrets were resilient enough to survive even the people trying to keep them.